I've been wanting to see the movie and didn't have a chance to see it in the theaters. I Can Only Imagine. We watched that last night. In the last 10 or 15 years, some of the most wonderful Christian-based movies have come out into the major theaters out in, I remember a time that if we wanted to see a Christian movie, or if I as a pastor wanted to present a Christian movie to our church, we didn't have even a video or a DVD, VHS or anything. We had to somehow find a huge projector and use a reel-to-reel or a 16, 32 millimeter film projector and have a movie in our, I've done that. And these things, it's not just like watching a television show. It's far more spiritual than watching Gunsmoke or Bonanza. There are actually some very good things that are, I believe, are as good as sermons, because I believe that they are sermons. They are messages. And people are finding Christ and hearing the message of the good news about Jesus simply by going to the movie theater and getting popcorn with gravy on it. It just, who would have thought? I remember years ago, as part of my testimony, many years ago, that my mother, for some reason, heard about the Billy Graham Association was going to be showing the movie at the Princess Theater. Now, my brother and I, we spent a lot of time at the Princess Theater. We were kids, and so we were all jammed up about going. We thought that'd be great. And I didn't know why Mom wanted to take us. I remember what day of the week it was. Seems like it might have been a Saturday, so it all seemed right. But we didn't stop and get any popcorn or a Coke or any jujubes or raisinets on the way in. There was a large crowd there, and I didn't know enough about church at the time, didn't attend church enough it might have given me away. It was kind of like church. Billy Graham Association had come in, and they had rented the theater to show a Christian movie. At the end, I think several churches had bonded together to sponsor this, and they extended an invitation. And that's the very first time I remember, as just a little boy, I was probably around 7 or 8 years old, that I felt the touch of God's hand on my heart. The movie touched me, the invitation moved me, and I think of that, I refer to that in my testimony, as a time when I believe that God first began to move in my heart, telling me that He loved me and that I needed Him and I needed to give my life to Him. And that was just as a very young boy, and it wasn't even in church, at the Princess Theater. So last night was very worthwhile. And if you get a chance to do that, sometimes if you need some guidance, I'll certainly be glad to do that. But if you hear about one of these movies, they usually don't disguise themselves. If there's someone that you're praying for, someone that you're trying to reach, someone that you'd like to hear about Jesus and about God's plan for their life, but you just can't get them into church, or you can't seem to get through to them in other ways, see if they'll go with you to the movie. Buy their way in, buy their ticket, get them some popcorn and a Coke, and it's just a wonderful way of sharing Christ. In Genesis chapter 6, it's just before the great flood of Noah. God is going to judge the earth and almost everybody on it. In verse 5 of Genesis chapter 6, it says, God saw that the wickedness of humanity was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Look at that again. That every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. God looked down from heaven, and he sees that humanity is in a very desperate situation. They've kind of reached almost a point of no return, of hopelessness. And here's the very first reference in the Bible to the human imagination. Every imagination of the thoughts of his heart. The imagination that takes place in our heart and mind is a part of our thoughts and process. And generally speaking, everything in our lives take place in our mind and in our imagination before they ever become a reality. We think about things and then we do them. We think about things and then we say them, or most of us do. Sometimes we say things without thinking, don't we? I guess we all do that. But there's something very real that happens in our thinking, our thought processes, our feelings, our emotion. We're intelligent people, and so it starts in our thoughts. And the problem is that God is not just condemning humanity or judging humanity because we have impure thoughts or bad thoughts, but because what we think and what we feel in our heart so often dictates how we behave and what we do, with the kind of people we are. And so our imagination is very important. As a matter of fact, God said that's kind of where it started. We kind of went sour on the inside first. That's where the imagination takes place. And so when you and I, ultimately, the solution was not God's judgment, but God's salvation. And what God wanted to do was not destroy us, but to save us. To save us, to rescue us. The Bible uses a lot of words, different kinds of words. Save, we understand, being in trouble and someone getting you out of trouble. To be rescued, someone to help you. But we talk about redemption, regeneration, being reborn, getting another start, being converted. To be converted means to be changed. And one of the things that God does is He saves us all over. He saves us, He saves our imagination, our conscience, our mind, our heart, our thoughts, our feelings. Every aspect of who you and I are, when we give our life to Christ, He has to perform some kind of spiritual surgery on us. He has to doctor on us. He has to perform miraculous, supernatural changes in us. All of us. And one of the things He does is He has to change the way we think. What we think about, our thoughts, our imagination. And so, as a Christian, as a child of God, you have a new imagination, and it doesn't think about evil things all the time, only all the time. You and I have the possibility of imagining good things, of thinking good thoughts, and of coming to understandings in our heart and in our mind. We can have good things going on inside of us that affect the way we act outwardly, the way we treat people, the way we do, the way we live our lives, what we say, what comes out of us starts in us first of all. So I want you this morning, prompted by our view into the imaginary last night, which was actually a real and true story, I want you to join me in just a few minutes this morning, imagining heaven. Let's look at the very first verse of the Bible, Andy. Let's look at Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1. I want you to imagine heaven. For me, my imagination is linked very closely to my faith. And sometimes I can't see the distinction between imagining something. You see, it's based on the word image. To image. An image is the shape and the form. And my faith helps me see the shape and the form or the outline or the substance of things that have never been a part of my life yet, or I haven't seen, or I haven't touched or handled. I'm glad that I have a very active and healthy imagination. I'm glad that I have a sanctified imagination, that God touched and moved my heart so that I can think as God created the heavens and the earth. I can think creatively. And God can inspire me and stir my heart and mind. On the inside, He can start a fire in me just in my thoughts, just in my heart. Before anything else ever comes out of my life, it can start there. And it's a wonderful process. Now here in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth." Now if you have a modern translation, you will see that the word heaven is plural. It says, God created the heavens. The Hebrew word is the word for heavens, is Shamayim. Shamayim. And it's always plural. Wherever you find the word heaven in the Old Testament, it's always plural, because when it says here that God created the heavens and the earth, the people that he was speaking to or revealing this truth to thought of the heavens as a place where the sun, the moon, and the stars, and the planets and the other parts of our galaxy and the universe existed. I guess there probably have always been people who thought that the earth was flat and that the stars and the planets were just points of light on a dome that were enshrouding the earth in its flatness. But we have hieroglyphs and petroglyphs and great monoliths, ancient writings, thousands and thousands of years old, that depict the great knowledge and a depth of understanding among ancient people about the stars and the planets and their orbit and the turning of the globes and the pathway of the different celestial bodies. Oh, it's on great carvings that are thousands of years old. Yes, there have always been a kook here or there who had flat earth ideas. But the great evidence that seems to be so overwhelming is that very ancient societies could plot. And even we see monoliths like the Great Pyramids of Giza, and that were mapped or placed on the plateau there in accordance with the belt of Orion. Orion is a stellar constellation. And the three pyramids there are placed exactly like the belt of Orion. The Old Testament itself mentions the Pleiades, the seven-star configuration of the astronomical body that we know as the Pleiades. For thousands of years, ancient human beings, whether God told them or gave them the ability to intellectually figure it out or spy it or see it, thought of the heavens. And they were not ignorant or foolish or stupid about the way things really are. They were not blinded or ignorant. They had great wisdom, great knowledge, and great understanding of the pathway and the trails and the orbits that our world, that God created, travels in. But God, at this point, had never revealed about his presence in the place that would be described as his abode, and what we think of today, after much revelation, as heaven. When it says here that God created the heavens and the earth, the heavens were the planetary bodies. But men did have an inkling or an idea of a difference between where I am here and where God is. There's a distance, there's a separation between us. We need to know that in so many different ways. If you look and you learn about a man, and we're not going to turn there because I have a few other passages to look at, but there was a man that is told about in the genealogy of humanity. His name was Enoch. Enoch he's described as a man who walked with God. In other words, he had a good relationship with God. He had a personal relationship with God. And then it says, but he was not. One day, just all of a sudden, he was not. Enoch was not. In other words, he disappeared. The Bible says, for God took him. And so there's a sense where Enoch was here just like me and you, walking about, and all of a sudden, God took him. So there's a sense that God wants us to understand and has wanted us to understand that there is a place where you and I are physically, historically, geographically, really, and there's a place where God is. He's real. And Enoch, just all of a sudden, was no longer here. He went to be with God. Now, one of the oldest Bible records that we have is probably the book of Job. And the amazing thing is that there's probably no one who talks about what happens to us when we die more than Job. Job really wasn't certain about things, and there were a lot of things he didn't know. There were many, many things that God had never told anyone, and yet it's apparent that Job had used his imagination to try to figure out what happens to us body, what happens to our real self, our person when we die. What comes after this life? Will I see my Savior, my Redeemer, my God after I'm dead? This is one of the oldest books of the Bible. It's not the first book of the Bible, but Job was older than Abraham, older than Moses and the prophets. The Bible tells us that the prophet Elijah, at the end of his life, the end of his ministry here, the end of his life here on earth had come, and it says that God sent a fiery chariot drawn by fiery horses. It's a very dramatic thing. And he swooped Elijah right up and took him from where he was to where he is today. It didn't say he took him to heaven, but we knew that when Elijah took off that he was going to be with God. The Old Testament saints, you'll not find now in the Psalms, most often and throughout the Old Testament, when people are talking or kind of get to wrap their mind around and extend their imagination to where God is, they talked about God as being on a mountaintop. A lot of times God would meet people for important meetings on mountains, like Mount Sinai, where he gave Moses the Ten Commandments. As a matter of fact, some of the names by which God is described, like Elohim, El Shaddai, which is God Almighty, El Elyon, the eternal God. The word El in the Hebrew language means mountain. Mountain. They thought that that's when God came from wherever he's at, getting as close to us as he's permitting us to get close to him. So they thought of the mountaintops. David brought it down a little bit further in his mind and in his imagination, and he spoke sometimes about God sitting upon a throne. Now, in the New Testament, we see God sitting upon a throne up in heaven. But David knew that he sat on a throne, and he thought of God, and that's how he thought of God in those terms, sitting on a throne, having a crown, or being the king. Much like he knew that he was just pretending to be a king, but God was a real king with a real crown and a real throne. Look with me, Annie, let's look at the Gospel of John, chapter 14. The Gospel of John, chapter 14. No one took our imagination to greater heights about heaven than Jesus. Jesus described himself as someone who came down from heaven. I remember when we in youth choir at Flint, one of the songs that we sang was, "Heaven came down and glory filled my soul." When we're talking about heaven coming down, we're talking about Jesus coming down. He came from heaven to the earth. In John's Gospel, chapter 14, Jesus is trying to prepare his disciples for his departure. He's going back to where he came, from whence he came. So here's this dichotomy again. Here we are on earth. But Jesus didn't come from earth. He came from somewhere else. And Jesus began to tell them, I'm going back to be with my Father. So there's a sense that God was expecting believers in that day and in that time to grow in their understanding. There's God, and we're here. But Jesus came here because God loves us, so that he could take us there. That's what he says right here. Jesus says in verse 1, "Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me." God's out there. You believe in God, believe in me. I'm here, right here with you. In my Father's house, in other words, where God lives are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you, I go to prepare a place for you. He says, I'm going to where God is. And I'm going to prepare a place for you. I'm going to get a place. We know that kind of language is. It's like you're having someone come over to your house. We'll fix you a pallet. We'll pull out the fold-up bed. We'll kick the dog off the foot of the bed and you can sleep in the bed. Jesus said, I'm going to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. He says, I came from there, I'm going back. But he says, I'm coming back to take you back with me, where God lives. They had never heard things like this. They had never imagined this kind of thinking about going to live in heaven with God. And that Jesus was here. They'd never met anybody before who came from heaven and who was here. They were convinced there was something extraordinary about Jesus. And they didn't doubt it for 1 minute when he says, I came from my Father. You believe in God? That's where I came from. I came from God. Look at Acts chapter 1 there, Andy. Acts chapter 1. After Jesus had been crucified. Let's look at take verse 10 up to the top of the page. I tell you what, let's look at 8, verse 8. Take it to the top. I want to make sure you not cut it too short. Jesus said, you're going to receive power after the Holy Spirit come upon you, and you'll be witnesses to me both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria to the uttermost part of the earth. And when he had spoken these things, while they beheld, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. Two angels are in just a moment going to say Jesus is going to come back someday just like this. He's going to come in the clouds. Jesus, remember in John 14, he says, if it weren't so, I would have told you. He says, I'm going to prepare a place for you, and if I'm going to prepare a place for you, I'll come again. Jesus, right here, he's leaving. He's going up into the clouds. And here again, the disciples are being given more to think about. More to add to their understanding and comprehension. I didn't see this, but I look at this and it allows my imagination to run wild. I can see, literally imagine, Jesus being there with his disciples and talking to them and then just all of a sudden taking off and going up into the clouds. I can almost feel my head raise and my neck crane. My imagination takes over because I believe this actually really happened. And I can relive it as if I were there. And that helps my preaching a lot, I think, sometimes, because it's very important for you and me to understand that these things that happen, that we can believe them, and actually we can let God touch our hearts and minds and say, just think about it as if you were there and you can see it happening. Look over at 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Paul here says in verse 2, he says, I knew a man in Christ around 14 years ago. He said, whether in the body, I can't tell, or out of the body. He said, it might have just been my imagination. Such a one was caught up into the third heaven. Look at verse 4. How that he was caught up into paradise and heard unspeakable words, which is not lawful for a man to utter. Of such a one will I glory, yet myself I will not glory, but in mine own infirmities. He said, I heard about a guy that God just reached down and took him up into paradise. You know what Paul is saying? I can imagine that. I really believe that happened. And the only reason he's telling me and you is because we didn't see it. He says, think about that. Think about someone being brought up. You see, they thought of the first heaven. It's a little more developed in the New Testament times. The first heaven, they thought of the blue sky. And the second heaven was like the planets and the stars. The third heaven, they thought, well, that's where God's couch is at. That's where the throne of God, that's the presence of God. He said, man was caught up into the third heaven. He says, think about that. Well, I've got a good imagination, but that's hard for me to imagine, but that's what Paul is saying. Imagine that. Imagine that. He says, man, I couldn't brag about something like that for myself. But he says, I'm telling you that that's something to brag about. Look at Revelation chapter 4, Amy. Revelation chapter 4. Now, I'm not sure that heaven looks like this all the time. I believe this was an arrangement. I believe God threw this, kind of like you might have a get-together or a party. It's a special occasion. But here in Revelation chapter 4, the Apostle John is given a view of what's about to happen. You see, the deed, the ownership document of all creation has been sealed. and it's about to be presented. It's going on the auction block. It has been forfeited, and so it's kind of like having an estate sale, and God is saying, here is the whole earth. It's been repossessed. It's been dispossessed. And God is showing an interest in reclaiming it, redeeming it. So he's called this special meeting in heaven. And this is what it looked like. John was given a possibility of seeing. After this I looked, and behold, a door was opened in heaven. And he didn't say in the heavens, he said in heaven. And the first voice that I heard was like a trumpet talking to me, which said, come up here, and I'll show you things which are to be hereafter. And immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. And he that sat on the throne looked like a jasper and a sardian stone. And there was a rainbow round about the throne, in sight like unto an emerald. And round about the throne were 24 seats. Upon the seats I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white raiment. And they had on their heads crowns of gold. And out of the throne proceeded lightnings and thunderings and voices. And there were 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. Take verse 6 up to the top there, and he says, before the throne, in front of the throne, there was a sea of glass like unto crystal. And in the midst of the throne, round about the throne, were the 4 beasts full of eyes before and behind. Man, a lot of this that John says, I know he's doing the very best that he can to describe it, but I've never seen an emerald that looked like a rainbow. They all pretty much look like green to me. A sea of glass like crystal. Never seen anything like that. A big sea or like an ocean that was just flat as glass. It was like, and John, I know you're trying to help me imagine this. And I see the throne, the 24 elders, the apostles, we find out later on, and the disciples. The heads of the 12 tribes of Israel of the Old Testament, and the 12 apostles of the New Testament, and it's like a business meeting. All the dignitaries of heaven are there, and God's on the throne, and they're about to decide something. Like I said, there's no indication that the Bible's saying, well, when you get to heaven, this is what it's going to be like, or this is what you're going to see. But what it is saying is that when John got to heaven, this is what he saw at that moment. And John is really telling us, I want to try to help you imagine this. Can you imagine that? I'm saying, John, I appreciate you telling about the colors and a certain kind of jewel or metal or and the trumpet sound, a voice that sounded like a trumpet, and I know you're doing the best you can, and you're doing it exactly the way God's leading you to do it, but it's a little hard. It's a little hard to imagine. Look with me to Revelation 21, Andy. Whatever heaven is like, I can't. If you live with a woman for a little while, you know what she's going to do? She's going to decorate things. And she's going to rearrange the furniture. And she's going to move things around. Now, it doesn't make any sense. Men don't say, oh, I kind of like my chair where it's always been. You might as well be quiet. Now, Randy's an old bachelor. His house, every time I go there, everything is just exactly where it's supposed to be. Now, if it's a wonder his house cleaner doesn't come over there and just change everything every once in a while just to see it changed. Maybe she does, and he changes it back. I don't know. But over thousands of years, as creative and wonderfully expressive as our God is, there's no telling in the world what heaven has looked like over the millennia. There's no telling what the colors and the shades and the shapes and the furnishings have been like, because he's always doing. If I look out in the backyard, I see things God's doing differently all the time, and in the skies and all around the world, and everything changes and moves through seasons and through stages and phases. Whatever John saw was glorious and wonderful, and he tried to describe it to us so that we could imagine it. But I imagine that heaven is just like everything else He's ever done. It's always being shuffled around. Let me show you the ultimate expression of that. Here in Revelation 21, verse 1 says, and John says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. If you and I got to go right now, maybe we will. You know, Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, to be absent from the body, to be present with the Lord. When you get to heaven, there's no telling what it'll look like. I believe that you should just try to imagine what it would be like. But John says one of these days God's going to look at heaven. Look at heaven with all of its glory and all of its splendor and all of its beauty. And God's going to say, this whole thing wore out. This whole thing is done. I'm tired of looking at it. John says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Whatever you and I imagine about heaven right now, or if God opened a portal to let you see heaven, or if you and I pass from this world and we wake up in heaven, one day it's all going to be done away with. And God's going to start all over. There's a few things, as a matter of fact, there's quite a few things in life that I've redone, that I've remade, I've reconstructed. I've tore it up and started over. And I wish that I could tell you that every time I redid something that it was better the second time. That's not true. Sometimes I make things worse. But every time God recreates something, it's always better. It's always more wonderful. Imagine what heaven is like. You know, the reason I want you to imagine is because the Bible doesn't tell us very much about heaven. The Bible doesn't tell us very much about heaven. And so we can use Bible verses and passages, some of the ones that I've read to you this morning, for us to think about. I wonder what heaven is like. And sometimes when you are hurried and harried, or you're tired, or you're sick or hurt, and you're going through tremendous difficulties and life seems to be so hard, let God fill your heart and your mind with thoughts of what heaven may be like. Do you know why God doesn't say much about heaven? We have to be careful. You get to wanting to be in heaven so much. I hear Randy talking about his mom and dad often. He misses them. But I'm glad Randy's here. I don't want him to go to heaven. I want him to stay around for a while. When he gets to heaven, he'll see his mom and dad, be reunited with them. If we had a real clear picture and a real perfect understanding of what heaven was like, all we do, I believe, is sit around wishing we were there. And so God doesn't tell us much, just enough to say, I'm preparing a place for you, and I'm going to come and get you. But don't let that consume every minute and every hour of the day. What is heaven going to be like? I believe that there are some verses and passages, there's some biblical revelation that helps us a little bit. But for the most part, you're going to have to say, I can only imagine. Have you ever really listened to that song? Have you ever really listened to that song, its lyrics? He says in the song, am I gonna run up and hug him around the neck? Or maybe I'm just going to fall down on the ground. Am I going to sing hallelujah? Or maybe I won't even be able to speak at all. I won't even be able to say anything. He mentions, am I going to dance a jig or turn cartwheels or will I? And really what the song is saying is this, I don't know what heaven is going to be like. And I don't know what I'm going to do when I get there. But I'm thinking about it. That's what that song is saying. And I believe the reason it is so popular and the reason it touches my heart and your heart so powerfully is because it's a great deal like the Bible. And it's saying, have you thought about when you get to heaven? I've got a painting that I've found on the internet. Should have brought it this morning. Yeah, I'll bring it tonight. And found it and I put it on my Facebook page several months ago, I guess. And it's just entitled, it's by a Korean painter, and it's called The First Day in Heaven. And it's a young woman. She's probably in her late 20s. And she's got a colorful shirt on and some blue jeans and flip-flops. And it looks like she has just run and just jumped into the arms of Jesus. She's just so happy. And she's crying and she's laughing. And you can't even really see the face of Jesus. You just see that he's got her all wrapped up. The first day in heaven. I don't know what it's going to be like. You may say, well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to tell him that. I'm going to look at this. I'm going to walk over here. I'm going to stroll over heaven. I'm going to. But I believe Bart is probably right when he says, man, I don't know. I don't know. I can only imagine what it's going to be like. But he knows he's going to get there. He knows it's real. He knows it's not something that he's just imagined, that he's only imagined. He's imagined it, and it's real. It's waiting for him, for you, for me. I had a chorus. I thought sure there was more to it. I looked all over the internet in preparation for this sermon. But then that was wrong. I know one other verse, but thinking back on it, that I probably wrote the second verse that I sang. It's something you kind of sing it around. We've sung it at camp, I guess. You know it, don't you? Heaven is a wonderful place, filled with glory and grace. I want to see my Savior's face. Heaven is a wonderful place. We sing about and talk about and preach about and teach about walls of jasper, gates of pearl, streets of gold, cabins in the corner. And I know we enjoy all of those, and they're a part of somebody, some songwriter or poem writer's imagination. We revel in it. And a lot of that we see comes right out of the reality of the Scriptures. But in all the songs and the sermons and the lessons and the prayers and our thoughts and our testimonies, I hear from you, from us, the reason heaven is a wonderful place is because we want to see Jesus' face. We shall behold him. That's what we sing. We'll see him. I like a song a good friend of mine sings it. He's from Willow Springs, Ronnie Cornelius. He sings about it. He said, I dreamed I went to heaven. And he said, well, there's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he says, well, I saw some old friends and family members, and they were evidently giving him the tour and welcoming him home. And then after a little bit, after being patient and being gracious, he said, I want to see Jesus. He's the one who died for me. Appreciate the tour. It's good to see everybody. The only reason I came is I want to see Jesus. That's what I've imagined for all of my days. I want to see Jesus. Would you pray with me? Father, thank you for your goodness and gloriousness. However feeble my mind gets, or how forgetful, how discoordinated my thinking may get, I pray that you would always make my heart and mind fruitful in imagining the glories of heaven, what it will be like. I don't know what it's going to be like, for sure. There are certain, in many things I believe. There are so many things that I can only imagine. If there is anyone here today who is brokenhearted or their heart or mind is dark, I pray that you give them a renewed vision, a clear sight. Recreate in their hearts, mind, and thinking images of heaven. Because that's where you are. It's where you're waiting. You're preparing a place for them. And oh, it's just going to be so wonderful. It's going to be far more wonderful than we can imagine. But help us imagine nonetheless. Lord, I pray it in your name. Amen. Brother Danny, what's our